Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a genuinely fascinating deep dive into one of the most enduring stories in human history. Now, you might think you know this story inside and out, right? The Cursed Prince, the Enchanted Castle, the Talking Teacups, we've all been there. But today, we're going to look at the incredible evolution of this classic tale. We're going to explore how a story that basically began as ancient folklore transformed into an 18th century literary sensation, was reinvented as a mid-century surrealist film, and ultimately became a modern psychological masterpiece. So get ready to see a very familiar story in a completely new light.
To really set the mood for our journey, I want to share this gorgeous cinematic preamble. It was written by the French filmmaker Jean Cocteau. For his brilliant 1946 adaptation, he wrote, "Children believe what we tell them. I ask of you a little of this childlike sympathy. Once upon a time." Isn't that just beautiful? It really casts this wonderful, mysterious spell over the analysis we're about to undertake. It's a great reminder that to truly understand the depth and the staying power of a fairy tale, we kind of have to approach it with an open mind, a sense of wonder, and a willingness to be enchanted.
Okay, let's dive into this historical timeline. The core DNA of this tale goes all the way back to the 2nd century with Cupid and Psyche. But the story we actually recognize, that crystallized in 1740 with Villeneuve, was heavily revised in 1756 by Beaumont, reimagined on film in 1946 by Cocteau, and then of course became the 1991 Disney animated classic.
Section 1. Origins of the Beast.
So the really crucial point here is understanding the battle between the two original French texts. The evolution from Villeneuve to Beaumont is essentially a masterclass in editing. Back in 1740, Villeneuve published this massive, sprawling epic for adults. It had intricate fairy politics, warring kingdoms, secret royal bloodlines for both Beauty and the Beast, the whole shebang. But just 16 years later, Beaumont aggressively pared it down. She stripped away all those dense backstories, made Beauty a simple merchant's daughter, and created the streamlined, archetypal fairy tale that we basically all know today.
Actually, before we move past Villeneuve's 1740 version entirely, we absolutely have to talk about some of the wild trivia from her original text because it is crazy. In her epic, the merchant didn't just have Beauty and a couple of awful sisters, he literally had 12 children. And the Beast, he was a prince cursed by an evil fairy simply because he refused to marry her. Meanwhile, a good fairy masters a terrible spell to turn herself into a bear just to save the infant princess. And to top it all off, Beauty is constantly having vivid dream sequences featuring a handsome unknown man, leaving her totally conflicted. It's incredibly complex lore that just vanished from history.
Section 2. A 1946 surrealist masterpiece.
You've really got to appreciate the sheer ingenuity required to make Jean Cocteau's film. He was shooting in France right after World War II, so we're talking zero budget, incredibly limited resources. Those sweeping, flamboyant costumes, crafted from WW2 fabric scraps. The creepy, living castle walls with human faces staring out, they literally covered children's faces in plaster and had them stand completely still behind the set. No way, right? And that iconic scene of the self-lighting candles? They just had the actor walk backward, blowing them out, and then ran the film in reverse. Absolute masterclass in practical effects.
And then, of course, there's the Beast himself, played by the legendary Jean Marais. The physical toll was just grueling. 3 agonizing hours every single day for the mask, fur, and claws. But the best part is the inspiration. Instead of a mythical monster, Cocteau modeled the Beast's face after a real-life Alaskan husky named Muluk. And because the prosthetic teeth were hooked right into his mouth, Marais could barely chew anything. He practically lived on soup for the entire production.
But, the results of all that suffering was pure cinematic immortality. The legendary critic Roger Ebert eventually added it to his great movies list. He wrote, "A fantasy alive with trick shots and astonishing effects, giving us a beast who is lonely like a man and misunderstood like an animal." That perfectly captures the emotional soul Cocteau injected into this monstrous character. Section 3. Disney and the Stage.
Fast forward a few decades, and contemporary versions took the core of Beaumont's streamlined tale, mixed in the visual flair of Cocteau's living castle, and created these dynamic, family-friendly musicals. Whether it's the 1991 film or the massive Broadway productions, these adaptations use soaring melodies and bright colors to really soften the darker edges of the original tale. They're specifically designed to teach children about empathy, resisting our own inner beasts, and the sheer transformative power of inner goodness.
Section 4. Faithful to the original.
Which brings up a really fascinating question.
Did Disney actually stay true to the original 18th century text? I mean, when you adopt a dense, 250-year-old French novel into a 90-minute animated musical for a modern audience, you have to make some serious narrative choices, right? Storytelling values change, and adaptation always requires compromise.
And this brilliantly illustrates the specific trade-offs they made. On one hand, yes, we lost Villeneuve's dense fairy politics, the complex subplots with the other siblings, and the darker psychology of a captive falling for a captor. But, in return, we gained catchy musical numbers, those hilarious comedic sidekicks bringing the castle to life, a much clearer moral center, and arguably a far more independent heroine. The modern beauty loves to read, fiercely dreams of adventure, and actively rejects the toxic men in her village.
Section 5. Body versus the soul.
Now, to really understand the deep psychological layers here, we have to look at the brilliant contrast between the two male leads. Gaston has this exquisite, flawless outer beauty. Society celebrates him, but he hides a rotting, horrific inner morality. He's the true monster, just wearing a handsome disguise. The Beast, on the other hand, has a hideous outer shell that frightens everyone away. But underneath all that fur is a gentle, tender, and beautiful inner reality. Modern analysts point out that Gaston is the ultimate embodiment of narcissism. He looks in the mirror and sees absolute perfection, completely blind to his own toxic nature. The real tragedy is that the village initially rewards this. They elevate him as a hero literally just because of his jawline and muscles. He's the ultimate superficial villain, someone who believes outer beauty entitles him to absolutely whatever he wants.
But the psychological reading of the Beast, well, this is where things get incredibly profound. Critics argue his intense shame and isolation perfectly reflect extreme body image disorders. Psychologists even draw parallels to conditions like anorexia or body dysmorphia. The Beast looks in his magic mirror and sees an unlovable, grotesque monster. It's a total disconnect between his true self-worth and his physical perception. He hides in the dark, convinced he's unworthy of human connection, until beauty helps him accept himself.
And this leads us to a fascinating paradox raised by modern feminist critiques. The whole narrative preaches that inner beauty is what matters, right? Don't judge a book by its cover. Yet how does it inevitably end? The Beast is magically transformed back into a conventionally handsome prince. So critics ask, does the story actually challenge superficiality, or does it accidentally reinforce it by making conventional physical beauty the ultimate reward? It's a paradox that has kept this story vibrantly alive for centuries, forcing us to constantly reevaluate its message, which leaves us with one final provocative thought for today. As we look at these themes of narcissism, body dysmorphia, and superficiality, in a world obsessed with the mirror, are we feeding the beauty or the beast? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible history with me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.